Hola and welcome to Coffee with Avila. I am Aviana Lemaire, and on this channel, I talk about neurodivergence, specifically autism and ADHD, and greater living. And today I want to talk about this concept of ADHD special interest versus autistic special interest and how they converge in me. Because this is one of those things that kind of threw me off. And when I was trying to discover myself and figure out what my life actually was and how my brain actually worked, I came to the awareness that I'm definitely autistic before I knew I was ADHD. Part of the reason why I didn't make the ADHD connection is because there's all of this lore about crossover. I had run into that. You can't stop reading about it. And especially, I was going to be looking specifically for information and listening to stories from people who were having the experience of trying to figure this out and their diagnoses. Everything I was hearing, it was really emphasizing the crossover. A lot of this information, however, was coming from a time frame when it was believed that you were either autistic and therefore couldn't be ADHD, or you were ADHD and therefore could not be autistic. So now it's kind of different. Now it seems like there's a firestorm of information about both, but I'm not always finding a huge amount of information, and I think now is definitely the time to talk about it. So I'm going to talk about one specific subject on the special interest thing, because it seems like one of the things that really got me was ADHD special interests are very much supposed to be short term. They're very likely to be short term, and you're likely to have a million of them. Whereas autistic special interests have traditionally been described as something where you kind of start that from jump, you have it for life. It might last your entire life. It's going to be long term. You probably have a few. Those are a lot of differences. And it's part of what threw me off, because I would listen to people, they'd be like, oh, well, it's not, if it's ADHD, then you'll have a million tiny interests and they won't last for very long. Now, I don't know that I was really keying into the concept of what's a special interest, so to speak, versus just a regular interest. I didn't really associate some of my short interests with that term, because I had learned that term through sort of the autistic vernacular and the diagnostic vernacular, kind of meaning it's a really intense thing and you're basically married to that interest for the rest of your life. So I never really thought of some of my short-term interests as being like that. But the more I get used to myself, my autistic brain, my ADHD brain, all the traits, and I'm listening to other people's stories and their experiences, I'm realizing they always were. I always had a lot of short-term special interests. And I've made a bunch of notes here because there's a lot of information in my head. I'm really trying to keep these videos on more of one subject at a time. My mind sees and connects everything, so I can bring in a million subjects, but I'm trying to keep it basically on track. So I wrote down some of my interests, and the reason I find this fascinating is that everything I'm about to say is both what clarified it for me eventually in my journey and what originally confused me. So, on the concept of the long-term autistic interests, I've always had a handful of interests, and the top ones that have been with me all of my life through, or from a very early age, like super early on in my life, I love music. That's been a lifelong thing. That's never going away. Believe me, that's never going away. Human sexuality, definitely another one. I could say sexuality in general. At some point, I was just fascinated in comparing between species and learning about the different behaviors of different animals. But it kind of lasts with human sexuality, possibly because I'm human, and I find that a heck of interesting because there's so many different layers to it and so many different things that connect. In connection with that, at some point later in my childhood, but fairly early, like definitely before puberty, I don't know, I was somewhere in the 7-year range, 6, 7, 7, 8, I don't know. I discovered psychology, and obviously I'd heard of it, but I got the concept of how vast it was, and I started studying it. It became interesting for myriad of reasons, partly because, as a side note, I was autistic and I didn't get the rest of the world because the rest of my world was basically holistic. So I didn't understand how people worked. And when I discovered psychology and all of the stuff in it, it became an instruction manual that helped me to communicate with people who couldn't communicate back with me. So that, I mentioned that information because psychology as an interest kind of came in as a subcategory of previously existent interests. And I had always had this lifelong interest in spirituality. So that's basically like the top 4 that have been lifelong, really the top 3: sexuality, music, spirituality. And then I feel like psychology comes in as definitely a subcategory of spirituality, because a great deal of my interest in spirituality is that it's the search for explanation. And for me, it explains things. And sometimes you do not get the kind of detail, the specific information that can help you on a day-to-day basis interacting with people from, in my experience. I didn't get that from spirituality, religion, all that stuff. So psychology came in, helped me understand what to say, how to say it, which language to choose, things like why somebody can hear you say the exact same thing. I feel like I've said the exact same thing twice. I've picked slightly different wording, but in one of those things they respond positively, and in one of those things they respond negatively, because they're hearing silent microaggressions in the second one. I didn't know about that stuff, and psychology gave me those specific details that helped me to understand my world and interaction a lot. So those are the top interests, and part of the way that they linked in, those are like this traditional autistic top interest, right? Part of the way that those link in to my ADHD interest that have been shorter term by comparison is in this way. All of my life, if the main interest was, for instance, I'm going to bring up the sexuality one, the first one I've got on my list, that one has fed into some of my smaller term interests. They were big, they've lasted a few years, I'm still fascinated, but I don't delve into them like crazy for decades at a time. That's a smaller one. It's both a subcategory of the autistic main interest that's lasted all of my life, and that subcategory I didn't mention, but it's like, did I mention it? BDSM? Because once I recognized this about myself, that that's my identity, it became very interesting for me, because I suddenly had access to a community where, instead of looking at documentaries and studies and things from the outside and a different perspective, I got to get a really personal connection with people who really know what they're talking about in a functional, first-hand informational way. And I always say first-hand information, first-hand knowledge is queen. That's the number one thing. You're doing it, you get why you're doing it. Sometimes people theorize about things, but you're living this life. Maybe you've had time to think about it. A lot of people don't get all the specifics about their connection with their kinks and all this stuff, but a lot of people, we've been thinking about it for a long time. That was me. So when I ran into that awareness and I came into my personality as a dominant human female in a world where I was been told that wasn't a thing, or it was a horrible thing and all this different stuff, I got so interested in that world, and I delved in, and I was like, oh, well, this is it. This is going to be a brand new special interest, like a tip-top interest, as I call it, tip-top interest that's going to last the rest of my life. What happened was that it was kind of shiny and new, because this had always been me, but I didn't know all these different terms, and there was a community for everything. And if there's something that you're interested in or that feels more comfortable to you than what you were fed and delivered and had access to in the vanilla world, which is like, for anyone who doesn't know, vanilla is basically the name for anything that's not technically counting as BDSM or as kink. So once I realized, I got so interested, I delved in, I learned all these terms, I learned the psychology of this different stuff, and that it cross-links, BDSM and the psychology of it cross-links with that other lifelong interest in psychology. So there we have at least 2, maybe 3 of my sort of autistic long-term interests. Sexuality, it's fairly easy to understand why that would feed into a subcategory of BDSM, because they tend to be, they don't have to be linked, but they tend to be linked. And for me, that's part of my experience with it. Then as psychology goes, I wanted to understand the psychology of my experience on this life, of denying such a thing or being told such things about it that I felt like it wasn't even something I could recognize in myself because I didn't relate. So there's a psychological aspect of it, and psychology is one of my top lifelong interests as an autist, feeding into the smaller kind of short-term interest in BDSM. I'll always be interested in it, but that thing where I find myself just feeding myself throughout the whole history of my life, I've just always been able to look up anything sexuality oriented, keep looking it up, finding new information, learning new science, delving deeper into the details I already have. And again, with BDSM, I kind of looked it up for a few years and felt like, okay, my interest is kind of waning, which is disappointing because it was so much fun, but it didn't have that power to go past that like 3-year mark or so where I felt like I was in it. Eventually, I felt like I'd kind of gained the majority of the stuff I needed or wanted at that point in my life, partly because so much of my life was in flux and I wanted to do other things, but it just kind of naturally faded away. So that's why I'm counting it, even though it lasted a few years, as a shorter term one. And I will give information about even shorter term ones later, because sometimes it lasts for a few minutes or a few hours. But I am super interested while it's taking place. But also, like another one of the ways that the long-term interest fed in was spirituality. For me, that's a lot about understanding life and identity and how you view the world. I was raised in a world where I had to be and play the role of submissive. I'm not going to get into the psychological effects on that or the spiritual effects, psychological or spiritual effects of that on me and my life, but there were spiritual effects, and that definitely awakened a lot of things in me as far as understanding balance, my connection with God, and my ability to believe once I was able to embrace my identity and see it as being natural and nothing wrong with that. And in fact, I think the way I was built as a human female, then yeah, that tied in at least all three of those things, sexuality, psychology, and spirituality, into that shorter term ADHD interest, even though it lasted for a few years. Other things, like I have a lot of examples, but I'm not going to go into detail because I just went into detail on that. But like with music being a lifelong interest, that's like an autistic top interest, I had that shorter interest that's a subcategory of it. And also, I think, was powered by the ADHD thing. A while back, you know, the lo-fi trend in music, I just started to get really interested in this for multiple reasons. I had grown up in a time frame of people making music on cassette tapes, like small artists and bands, and recording these things and copying them and making their start, or, you know, getting their career going and getting the word out. And when I was a child, people were calling it low fidelity. I mean, lo-fi just stands for low fidelity. So I was thinking, okay, this is interesting. It's like the digital version of that. So I got very interested into researching it. And long story short, that interest really only lasted for a few days. Specifically, the lo-fi interest really only lasted for a few days. I delved, I researched, and I discovered, okay, this thing really isn't for me. I'm not really into it, or at least not at this point in my life, not in this way. Excuse me. I'm gonna have some of my tea now. It's not coffee today. Today it's tea. I'm having a strawberry tea. A strawberry green tea, but I'm going to need to sip it more often because I can tell my throat is getting dry. But that lo-fi thing stuck around, and it just lasted for a few days, but I was all the way into it, and I thought, oh, this is going to have the power and the steam, because it was making me think of that like old-fashioned thing where the artist, the smaller artist, was getting the job done with whatever they had available to them. I was like, this is the digital version of that, which piqued my interest. But then when I realized it didn't resonate with me, it just kind of faded away. Again, subcategory of the long-term music interest, but just didn't have the power to keep going. So there are different things, like with psychology, I can have the general interest in the whole field. A shorter term version of that might be if I get interested in a particular person. Let's say a particular person has an extremely fascinating story to tell, and I'm very interested in their story for a while, then that might fade away. I might be interested just while I'm listening to them speak, and that can feed off into a bunch of other smaller interests where they mention stuff or they're talking about their experience. Somebody who has a different, for instance, neurodivergence than I have and something I can't fully relate to, I'm very interested in listening and learning about that. But it doesn't necessarily become like that one particular interest. Like if I am a person who experiences hyperphantasia, this is how my brain works. I see, hear, experience everything all of the time. It's just how I'm built. So I'm very curious about someone who's talking about their experience of aphantasia, where you might not see images, or perhaps you don't see images or hear sounds and have all of that, the whole field of senses in your mind, like the mind's eye, or I might call it mind's ear, etc. Someone was talking about that the other day. I guarantee you I'm gonna go do more research into that, because that's interesting. I'm trying not to get into detail because it gets me. But I haven't become deeply fascinated in every aspect of the mind, like hyperphantasia, how it works, everybody's experiences. I'm interested and I delve into it, but it tapers off. It peaks, it tapers off. I forget about it, I do other things, I come back. Now that's a smaller interest. It's probably going to be lasting because it's always going to be fascinating, but it's never taken up a huge amount of my time. A good example of some really, really short-term interests. There are so many of them, I can't begin to imagine, because it's been a long enough life that I don't even know. Sometimes I have interests that will last me for just a few days, like I said with the lo-fi. One that I think is pretty amusing lasted for literally just a few hours one night. No. It was probably something like 1 or 2 hours one night. And it's kind of amusing now, but it really wasn't funny then. Mating season had arrived for bugs. And I was desperately trying to sleep every night and kept hearing these insane noises outside of my window for hours. And I just kept thinking, crickets. The crickets. I can't believe how loud the crickets are. How many crickets can there be? I swear I've never heard it like this before. I've heard crickets chirping. But this is part of what made it an interest. It was kind of driving me insane. I'm trying to sleep every night and can't sleep because of the sounds that they're making. It was so loud I would have to put earplugs in. I was having to wear my noise buffering headphones during the day just so that I could try to function and play music and stuff and listen to my media through that, because it was getting to me. It was getting to me. So one night I was trying hard to sleep. I couldn't sleep because of this sound. I became obsessed because I wasn't sure if it was crickets. I was like, I need to understand crickets. I need to understand crickets, their mating seasons, and their calls. Because what if it's not a cricket? What if it's a cicada? So I need to look up cicadas and understand their mating seasons and their calls. So I got really into it one night, lying in bed, needing to be asleep, scrolling on my phone, typing in everything, looking up videos of crickets, looking up videos of cicadas, seeing some really interesting types of bugs, insects, whatever. I can't remember the rule for what makes it a bug or an insect, because that's not a top interest for me. But whatever they are, I think they're an insect, but I could easily be wrong. Anyone who knows the answer, leave it in the comments, because I might never look this up. By the time I finish talking about this, I might have fully forgotten in every way yet again. For some reason, I've looked it up, it doesn't stick with me. Probably because it's not a top interest. But I had that interest probably for an hour or two while I was trying to sleep, because it was driving me nuts and I couldn't stop obsessing. I just kept looking up and comparing different bugs. Oh, okay, cicadas, they make this noise during the daytime. Oh, crickets, they make it later at night. Oh, it's this time of year for these bugs. Oh, what's happening? I was assessing down to the detail, basically just because I needed to understand with laser sharp awareness which of these little animals was driving me bonkers in the nighttime. So that one, once I finally fell asleep that night, that interest not only went away, it actually kind of irritated me like crazy, because the crickets didn't stop. Apparently they were, by the way, crickets. I figured that much out. The interest didn't stop, but it kind of ended for me that night, because I ended up lying there clicking on this particular video with crickets in a cup. And the next thing I know, I don't know why I clicked on this, but the crickets were mating. which I guess you could say fell under a subcategory of general animal sexuality. But I just thought to myself, it's finally come to this. I'm watching crickets in a plastic disposable cup crawling up onto each other and, you know, enjoying life while they're living it. So at that moment, I just felt like, you know what, I'm done. I'm done looking this up. I'm done thinking about them screaming at me in the nighttime. And that pretty much ended the whole shebang. So that is something we're counting now in minutes or hours. But while I was interested in it, I was just obsessed because something triggered my interest. And it was coming from a really uncomfortable place. But I don't know why, for some reason, I've decided to tell this ridiculous story. That's what I do. Another example of a short-term interest, which I'm realizing is also animal-oriented. For some reason, at a certain time frame, I have that habit too, that's kind of an autistic habit that's well known, of picking up things like rocks and things. I love rocks. I love crystals. I love gemstones. I'm just into this. Ever since I was small, it was a well-known thing with me when I was an infant. I always wanted to be holding a rock. But I never tried to swallow it or put it in my mouth or anything. I would just hold it and it was perfectly safe. And I remember the time frame. I wasn't slightly interested in putting it into my mouth. It had been on the ground. I know what dogs and apparently crickets and magpies do on the ground, but I wasn't into that. I just always wanted these rocks, and I still want these rocks. So I like picking up stuff that looks interesting, like stuff around, right, like the property where I live. I'll pick up whatever is there, acorns and stuff like that. And not all the time, but every now and then one just really catches my eyes, and I'm thinking, this is just so pretty, this is so interesting. So I started saying, as an effect of this, I don't know why I'm a magpie. That was my explanation. I'm picking up another thing. I don't know why I'm a magpie. I'm picking up like a magpie. For some reason, I feel like I heard, as a child, I think I remember people saying magpies gather a lot, but I couldn't recall the details. So I decided to look it up, and I couldn't find anything about magpies specifically gathering things. Apparently, they don't even seem to be like gatherers as much as warrior birds. They're territorial. Here comes the information. Apparently, they're very territorial birds, and they will have like a region where this particular magpie or group of magpies is, and other magpies need not come because they will defend their region. So I started to find magpies very interesting, and I started to look that up, and they're hunters. The way they hunt for worms in the ground, they're just really interesting. They're kind of hardcore birds. I'm really into this. So that became a very big interest for just a few days. And then all of a sudden I was like, okay, I've seen enough information about magpies, and I just felt it. It's like I just knew. I'm done now. I don't need to look up these birds anymore. I feel like this is going to be the weirdest disjointed video, talking about everything from BDSM to worms being pulled out of the ground by warrior birds who defend their turf like there's some kind of magpie war going on. But this is how it works. I said there were a million subjects, and these are the subjects. Another note that I took is, with my channel, when I really love planning stuff like branding, images, banners and stuff. I get into it, the theme of it. When I decided to start this particular channel for all of my neurodivergent content, I was like, okay, this is a great idea. But when I finally got to the phase, because it felt comfortable, felt like I needed to do it, disambiguate everything, keep it all in one place. Somehow I had another channel, and somehow everything got confused because of what was going on in my life, which was very confused at the time. My content got confused, and there was too much on that channel. So I decided to pull out all my ND information and put it here. So then I have to decorate the channel. But I love to decorate it, so I got into that. And I love the art and everything, but from that sprung forth an extremely short-term interest in colors of the year. Because every year, obviously, there are, well, for people who know, obviously, there are Pantone colors of the year. And these things tend to have a meaning. It tends to be something like reflection of where we are at. So it's kind of like a reflection of the previous year. Here's where we are at as a nation or as a people. I'm not sure how big the scope is supposed to be, but some group of people, here's what we're experiencing. And because of that, here is the colors we've chosen. Here they are. Here's what they mean. Here is the tone that they give. It's relaxing, it's comforting, it's energizing, whatever it happens to be that year. And the reason why they're choosing those colors is supposed to also have to do with where we have been and what we need to move on. I thought this was very interesting. And again, I'm realizing this could kind of connect with my overall interest in psychology and spirituality, because it's about this energy that we have. Let me take another sip. Throat is drier than I realized. But I'm almost done, I thought. I just hadn't realized until this moment. I'm almost done, I thought. I'm almost done, I think. I hadn't realized until this moment that that falls underneath that psychological and spiritual category, where it's about life, figuring it out, meanings, the energy you're putting forth, what you're coming out of. But I thought for a while I was going to brand. The reason why it was colors of the year is because I thought I might brand my channel and change thematically every year so that my new branding reflects and showcases the colors of the year that year. However, this was weird for me, because whatever resonates with me in the moment resonates with me in the moment. And when I did that, the colors of the year were yellow and gray. And just for me as a person, I react very strongly to things like colors, and I'm more like a gem tone color. I don't know how much it can be seen, but my decor is like amethyst, sapphire, ruby type colors, and yellow doesn't hit it for me and gray doesn't hit it for me. I like them in context, but when I realized, I tried to work it in and I realized I really just can't do this. It's an interesting idea, but it's not going to work for me. And if it's that bad for me this year with two colors, I don't hate yellow, I don't hate gray, but I kind of, excuse me, hiccuping, I kind of just hated the look of them together at the time. I might love it in 3 years, but in 3 years it won't be the official color set of the year. So I lost interest in that pretty quickly because I just couldn't make it work. I didn't like how it was looking. And I just decided to brand everything with my own instincts. So I think I went with, the orangey thing that's still up now. Who knows what it'll be in the future, but for anyone looking at this in the future, it's this warm orangey color tone that I had. And the theme is like an afternoon at tea, like a nice, robust, spicy color tone, tea and coffee talk or coffee chat, like a cafe clatch or coffee clatch or however it's pronounced. I think it's just coffee clatch. So that's what I went with because it was instinct and that always works better. And it kind of ended my interest in the colors of the year, so that interest really only stayed for probably a few hours over the course of a few days when I had the time to specifically be working on that and my branding. So I have a whole lot of things that might last for a few hours, might last for a few minutes. I'm just suddenly realizing a little while back, I almost decided randomly because of ADHD impulsivity, I just decided I needed to buy 3 to 5 ocarinas